What if I told you that in the windswept valleys of the Wild West, where gunfights and gold rushes shaped legends, there was another story, a story no history book dared to tell, a question buried so deep it was never meant to be asked. How could two seemingly ordinary sisters command such fear that even the law refused to speak their names? The year was 1881. The mountains of Colorado whispered with the sound of pickaxes and the clinking of coins. But beneath the dust and promise of fortune lay something rotten, an unspoken terror that kept families awake at night. Travelers vanished. Voices spoke of rituals in the dark. And in a small wooden house at the edge of town, two sisters lived. With secrets so unspeakable, they threatened to unravel the very soul of the community. Why was this buried? Why were those who asked too many questions silenced? And why, even now, are fragments of their story missing? As if someone, or something, made sure it stayed hidden. This is the forbidden history of the Colorado sisters, and once you hear it, the Wild West will never look the same. The year 1881 carved its mark into Colorado with dust, sweat, and the echo of pickaxes striking rock. This was a frontier teetering between wildness and fragile order, a land where the promise of fortune pulled men from across the nation into the high valleys and narrow gulches, each carrying a dream heavy as the packs on their backs. Colorado was young, volatile, restless, and brutal. The silver boom had gripped its mountains, and the air itself seemed alive with a feverish urgency, as if the earth below might at any moment yield treasure or claim another life. Settlements sprang up overnight, crude camps quickly transformed into mining towns where rough wooden saloons stood crooked on the boardwalk, and lantern lights spilled through broken shutters to guide gamblers and drifters inside. Law here was more of a suggestion than a certainty. Sheriffs often had more enemies than friends, and deputies vanished as quickly as they appeared. Vigilantes dealt justice with ropes rather than courts, and men who crossed the wrong person might disappear without so much as a marker on the ground to remember them by. The Wild West was not a myth here. It was the very air people breathed. The townsfolk carried on with a constant, uneasy awareness that the wilderness pressed in on all sides, indifferent to their survival. Wolves howled beyond the tree line, and avalanches sometimes swept away entire mining camps in a heartbeat. Life was raw, every detail sharpened to survival. The stench of sweat, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies clung to the saloons, mingling with the sharp tang of cheap whiskey. At night, the wind funneled through the passes and rattled loose shutters, carrying with it the low moans of timber and the whispers of those who feared the dark held more than cold air. Churches stood with whitewashed simplicity, often no more than a single-room structure, their bells ringing hollow across valleys where more men believed in luck and violence than in salvation. The people who lived here were as varied as the mountains themselves. Miners, gaunt and bent-backed, staggered from shafts at dusk with blackened faces, their eyes hollow from endless labor in candle-lit tunnels where rockfalls could bury them alive. Women worked wherever they could, cooking, laundering, or in many cases, turning to saloon work, where a smile or a dance could mean survival. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and China mingled uneasily with drifters from the East. Soldiers left, adrift after wars, and native tribes pushed from their own lands. Everyone carried secrets, and everyone knew that the frontier was the place to run if you needed to outrun the past. The town at the center of this story was no different from the others dotting the map, though its isolation gave it a peculiar stillness. It sat nestled against a rise of pines, its main street a narrow path of packed dirt lined with false-fronted buildings pretending at grandeur they did not possess. By day, wagons creaked through, carrying supplies, lumber, or the occasional coffin, while children scurried in bare feet, laughing and chasing one another until a mother's voice called them back from danger. By night, the town changed. Gas lamps hissed as they flickered to life, and shadows stretched long, pulling the streets into something less human. Men drank themselves senseless. Fights broke out, and sometimes a single gunshot silenced the clamor for a moment before everything resumed, as if violence itself were part of the rhythm of the place. But beneath the daily chaos of survival was something subtler, something most townsfolk could not name but could sense all the same. There were certain houses people avoided after dark, certain corners of town where whispers hushed when footsteps drew near. In a place where every soul carried sin. Some carried more than others, and their presence unsettled even the most hardened drifters. This atmosphere, the constant tension between lawless freedom and unspoken fear, was the soil in which the story of the two sisters would take root. To understand what made their presence so striking, one has to feel the contrasts of the time. On one side were men with revolvers strapped to their belts, women with dirt embedded in their hands, and children growing up with calluses before they could spell their names. On the other side, emerging now and then like ghosts, were figures who seemed almost out of place, dressed with refinement, speaking with the tone of education, carrying themselves like they belonged to another world entirely. The sisters fell into this latter category, and it was this contrast that first drew attention to them. They did not belong in the grit and ruin of the Wild West, yet there they stood, drawing all eyes in a town where outsiders were usually treated with suspicion. The isolation of Colorado in 1881 amplified everything. A missing man was not just a rumor. It was a shift in the fragile balance of survival. A harsh winter could wipe out an entire camp if provisions fell short. Every life mattered, not only for its own sake, but for the ripple it caused in such a small, tightly bound community. And so, when things began to go wrong in the months leading to the summer of 1881, when whispers carried more dread than gossip, when mothers clutched their children closer and men eyed one another with suspicion, the weight of it all pressed heavily upon the town. This was a time when fear did not travel far. It rooted itself locally, smoldering like embers no one dared fan into flame. Fear of strangers, fear of the wilderness, fear of forces unseen. Colorado was a crucible where every hope and dread of the human spirit was laid bare against a backdrop of indifferent mountains. It was not merely a place on a map. It was a stage, set for tragedy, for secrets, for the kind of darkness that could only flourish where survival left little room for questions. Margaret and Eliza Holcomb arrived in the mining town with the quiet poise of women who had not been worn down by the wilderness. Where most women of the frontier bore calloused hands and weathered skin from endless toil, these sisters appeared untouched by hardship. Their clothes were modest yet well-tailored, a subtle mark that they had come from elsewhere, from a life that had given them refinement instead of raw survival. Their voices carried a cadence not native to the rugged streets of Colorado. It was softer, deliberate, educated in a way that set them apart immediately. In a place where civility often cracked under the weight of hunger and dust, the Holcomb sisters drew attention like flames in the dark. At first, the town welcomed them. Women admired their grace and envied their composure, while men admired them for reasons less polite. The sisters opened their doors to visitors, hosting evenings said to be filled with reading, music, and polite conversation. For a community that lived day to day on hard labor, gunfire, and whiskey, the notion of refinement was both exotic and suspicious. People came to listen to their voices, to sit in their parlor beneath the warm glow of oil lamps, where lace curtains softened the world outside, and strange perfumes lingered faintly in the air. Yet beneath this cultivated image lay something else, an undercurrent that no one could name, but that everyone felt. Margaret the elder carried herself with a kind of authority that unsettled men used to controlling the spaces they entered. She had a way of looking at someone, of letting silence linger just long enough that made people feel as though their thoughts were no longer their own. Eliza, quieter, almost timid in manner, often followed her sister's lead. Yet there was a strange intensity in her gaze, an almost feverish light that flickered behind her calm exterior. Together, they created a balance, one commanding, one observing, both bound in an intimacy that felt unbreakable. The women of the town whispered first. They noticed how the sisters kept to themselves during the day, their curtains drawn, their lamps burning long into the hours of the night. They noticed how the Holcombs rarely shopped for supplies like others did, yet always seemed to have what they needed. Children claimed to have seen flickering lights moving strangely in the sisters' windows, as though shadows performed a play upon the walls. But when their parents asked, the children could never explain what shapes they had seen. Men, meanwhile, spoke in hushed tones of the uncanny warmth inside the Holcomb house, a heat that seemed heavier than firelight, pressing down until their thoughts swam. Some claimed they lost track of time there, as though hours vanished like mist, and they emerged with fogged memories and an unease they could not shake. Their past was a subject no one could quite uncover. When asked, Margaret would smile and give an answer polite but vague, referencing an upbringing in the East, or a family of standing, yet never naming a place or a name that could be checked. Eliza rarely spoke of such things at all, preferring to change the subject with a soft laugh or a glance at her sister. It was as though their identities began and ended with that house, as though they had sprung from the very earth of the town itself, fully formed and unreadable. What made them especially compelling was the way they seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Margaret, with her commanding presence, appeared at church gatherings, speaking with calm eloquence that impressed the congregation. Eliza, more reclusive, was spotted at the edges of town, walking alone near the tree line, her figure pale and ghost-like against the pines, sometimes carrying small bundles no one dared ask about. Their presence lingered in people's minds long after they had gone, leaving behind questions that had no answers. As time passed, subtle fractures began to appear in the polished mask they presented. Visitors to their home reported hearing faint music when none was being played, a low hum that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards or behind the walls. One miner, after drinking too much whiskey, swore he had seen symbols scratched into the wood of their parlor table, carved in a hand too precise to be accidental. Another spoke of the sisters' eyes, claiming that when the lamps dimmed, their pupils seemed to widen unnaturally, swallowing the light in a way that unsettled even the bravest of men. Of course, these were dismissed as exaggerations, drunken tales spun for effect, but even dismissed stories leave their mark. It was the sisters' bond that drew the most speculation. In a town where families struggled and siblings often drifted apart, Margaret and Eliza were inseparable, speaking almost as if with one voice. They finished each other's sentences, shared glances that carried more weight than words, and rarely spent a moment apart. To outsiders, this closeness was unusual, and in the superstition-laden atmosphere of the frontier, anything unusual could quickly become sinister. Rumors spread that the sisters shared not only a household but secrets darker than any outsider could comprehend. Despite these whispers, their charm never waned. They had a way of disarming suspicion, of turning questions into admiration. A prospector might enter their home with doubts and leave praising their hospitality, even as unease coiled in his gut. A preacher might warn of temptation in private, but still find himself drawn to the warmth of their parlor. It was as though the Holcomb sisters wove a net of fascination around everyone they encountered, and once entangled, no one could quite pull themselves free. By the time the first man went missing, the sisters had already established themselves as part of the town's fabric, and so, when suspicions began to rise, when people whispered about who had last been seen in their company, the idea that Margaret and Eliza could be involved was too shocking, too unthinkable for most to accept. Their surface charm clashed violently with the growing unease, creating a tension that only deepened with time. What made the situation even more troubling was how the sisters seemed untouched by the dangers of frontier life. While others fell ill, starved, or broke under the crushing weight of survival, the Holcombs flourished. Their skin remained pale, their clothes immaculate, their household orderly. It was as though hardship glanced off them, never leaving its mark. This only heightened suspicion. In a place where suffering was universal, how could these women appear so serene, so untouchable, unless something unnatural protected them? It began almost without notice, the way such things often do. A single absence brushed off as a man chasing new fortune elsewhere. The first was a prospector, a wiry figure named James McCready, who had arrived in town with nothing but a mule, a pick, and the gleam of desperation in his eyes. He was last seen on a spring evening in 1881, stepping into the Holcomb sisters' home with a bundle of maps tucked under his arm. He told a companion at the saloon earlier that day that Margaret had promised to help him interpret old symbols he believed marked a hidden vein of silver in the nearby mountains. When days passed and his mule was found tethered and starving outside the livery, people muttered that he had abandoned his search, perhaps run off after some phantom strike. In Colorado, men vanished all the time, swallowed by avalanches, robbed on lonely trails, or simply drifting on when fortune soured. His disappearance, though strange, did not stir the town into alarm. But weeks later, another absence gnawed at the edges of the town's uneasy calm. Thomas Kearney, a deputy known for his stern face and measured drawl, failed to appear for duty. He was last seen walking with Margaret near dusk, his hat tipped respectfully as though escorting her somewhere. When questions arose, Margaret explained, with calm conviction, that he had spoken of leaving town, disillusioned by the lawlessness he could not contain. Many wanted to believe her. After all, who would dare accuse her directly? Yet the unease crept through whispers. Kearney had left. Behind his badge, his horse, and his pay still owed at the sheriff's office. A man like him did not simply disappear without collecting what was his. It was Eliza who was noticed next. On more than one occasion, she was spotted near the tree line at the edge of town, her small frame hunched beneath the weight of bundles. She carried at odd hours. A young boy delivering coal swore he saw her dragging something heavy through the brush one night, though when asked to describe it, his words faltered, his voice trembling. Soon after, that boy himself, barely 14, vanished. He had left his mother's cabin at dusk with a shovel slung over his shoulder, hired for an evening's work, and he never returned. His mother searched frantically, her cries echoing, down the main street, but no trace was ever found. The town consoled her with talk of runaways, but her hollow eyes carried the weight of a truth too dreadful to name. By the time a fourth man was reported missing, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. His name was Victor Alvarez, a merchant known for trading in fine fabrics and trinkets from the East. He had been drawn to the Holcombs' refinement, often supplying them with small luxuries, but one evening he confided to a drinking companion that Margaret had shown him letters of strange design she wished him to decipher. He claimed the letters looked older than any script he had seen, almost as if carved by a hand not of this age. The following morning, Alvarez was gone. His horse was found still stabled, his wares untouched, his ledger unfinished. The disappearances might have driven the town into open suspicion, but fear kept tongues bound. People spoke in murmurs, eyes darting toward the Holcomb house with its lace curtains and warm glow of lamplight that seemed to burn unnaturally steady through the darkest nights. There was something about the sisters that unsettled even the most hardened men, a sense that confrontation would lead not to answers, but to ruin. Still, stories began to spread. One miner swore he had seen men entering the Holcomb home and never emerging, shadows swallowed by the doorway as though it led somewhere other than the parlor inside. Another claimed to have heard strange cries carried on the night wind, half human, and half something else, emanating from the sisters' windows. A saloon girl whispered that Margaret had approached her once with an offer to ease her burdens for a price, but when pressed, the girl refused to speak more, only crossing herself and refusing to step near the sisters' street again. The Yastad sheriff himself seemed curiously reluctant to act. He dismissed concerns as hysteria, claiming men often left without a word, that miners and drifters had no loyalty to the towns they passed through. Yet some noted the way his eyes hardened when the sisters' names were mentioned, as though he knew more than he dared admit. Others believed he was complicit, either seduced by Margaret's strange charm or cowed into silence by something darker. The unease grew with every passing week, and yet the Holcomb home remained the center of a peculiar magnetism. People still accepted invitations, still lingered in their parlor, still found themselves unable to resist the pull of whatever warmth and refinement the sisters offered. It was as though reason itself faltered at their threshold, leaving only a hushed reverence and the echo of questions unspoken. Children too young to know fear's etiquette played cruel games in the dusty street, daring each other to run up to the Holcomb door and touch the latch. Some swore that when they pressed their ears to the wood, they heard voices chanting in low, rhythmic tones, words that carried no meaning yet filled their hearts with dread. One boy claimed he saw a figure move behind the curtain, tall, thin, and not like either sister. His story was dismissed as childish fancy, but he refused to walk past that house again. Each disappearance deepened the silence that gripped the town. Mothers called their children inside at dusk. Men who once swaggered down the street with pistols at their hips now kept their heads low when passing the sisters' home. The missing were not forgotten, but their names became things whispered, only behind closed doors, as though to speak them aloud might summon the same fate. The sisters, for their part, seemed untouched by the suspicions that swirled around them. Margaret continued to walk the streets with a calm dignity, her eyes steady, her smile faint but unwavering. Eliza appeared now and then with her quiet, almost shy demeanor, but those who met her gaze swore there was something fevered, something hungry in the stillness of her stare. Together they moved like figures from another world, untouchable, unshaken, while the town around them trembled with unease. By midsummer, the weight of the disappearances hung heavy over the community. The air itself seemed charged, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. People avoided the sisters' house after dark, but the glow of their lamps remained, burning steadily, as though mocking the fear they inspired. It was clear that something was festering, something that could not remain hidden forever, but no one dared name it aloud. The town was caught in a silence as oppressive as the mountains surrounding it, every whisper swallowed before it could take shape, every question smothered by the dread of what the answer might reveal. Rumors have a way of taking on lives of their own, but in Colorado during the summer of 1881, the whispers surrounding the Holcomb sisters did not behave like ordinary gossip. They moved differently, spoken in half-breaths, carrying a weight that bent the voices of even the most hardened men. What began as idle curiosity about the sisters' long nights and shuttered windows began to darken into something altogether more sinister. Talk of rituals, seances, and powers no ordinary woman should hold. It was the miners who first spoke of strange lights flickering in the sisters' parlor when the lamps of the rest of the town had gone dim. Passing late from the saloon, men reported seeing a glow that seemed to pulse, not steady like lamplight, but rhythmic, as though it rose and fell in time with something alive. One man swore he saw shadows moving across the lace curtains, shapes that stretched and twisted in ways that did not match human forms. When he told his companions, they laughed him off, but when pressed, his voice broke with the conviction of someone who knew he had seen something real, something that would not let him sleep. The stories grew. A saloon girl whispered that one evening Margaret had approached her and asked if she wished to speak with her deceased mother. The girl, hardened by life and not easily spooked, laughed it off, until Margaret took her hand and spoke words in a low murmur that made her knees tremble. She fled the house without looking back, but days later she confided to a friend that Margaret had told her things no stranger could have known. The exact words her mother spoke before death, secrets she had never shared aloud. The girl would not repeat the words, but her refusal to walk past the sisters' home after that night told its own story. Eliza, though quieter than her sister, was seen wandering at night, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth to the grove of pines just beyond town. A farmer claimed he saw her arranging small stones into circles beneath the trees, kneeling as though in prayer, but when he crept closer, the sounds she made were not words he recognized. He said it was chanting, low and guttural, like something torn from the throat of the earth itself. When he tried to tell the sheriff, he found his own tongue faltering, the memory clouding as if someone, or something, had muddled it in his mind. Inside the sisters' parlor, guests spoke of odd sensations. The air felt heavier there, pressing down on shoulders and chests, and more than one visitor said they heard faint music when no instrument was present. A merchant described how, while sitting with the sisters, he saw Margaret place her hands on the table and close her eyes. The oil lamp flickered, and in that moment the air grew cold enough for his breath to mist. He heard a voice, faint, distant, yet clear, speak his name, though no mouth moved. He left abruptly, pale and shaken, refusing to return. The children of the town, unbound by the caution of adults, played dangerous games around the Holcomb house. They dared each other to press their ears to the walls and listen. One boy swore he heard crying, but not like the crying of a woman or child. It was layered, as if several voices wept at once, rising and falling in unnatural harmony. Another said he heard scratching, the sound of nails dragging across wood. From the inside, though the walls stood smooth. These children spoke their fears in secret, but their mothers noticed the way they woke screaming in the night, their dreams poisoned by images they could not explain. The miners, a superstitious breed to begin with, began connecting the sisters with their own misfortunes. When a shaft collapsed, killing 3 men, it was said that Eliza had been seen walking toward the mountains the evening before, whispering to herself. When a fever swept through the camp, Margaret was accused of offering strange remedies that tasted bitter and left men more delirious than before. They began calling the sisters witches under their breath, though never within earshot, for fear the words themselves might bring down wrath. By midsummer, the whispers had sharpened into specific stories. One told of a séance held in the sisters' parlor where a group of men gathered to seek fortune's guidance. They sat at a round table, the lamps dimmed, Margaret at the head with her hands stretched over the wood. The men laughed at first, skeptical, until the table itself began to tremble, faintly at first and then violently, knocking glasses to the floor. One man swore he felt a hand grasp his wrist beneath the table, though every man's hands were visible above. Another claimed he heard his dead brother's voice whisper his name from the shadows. By dawn, the men were pale and shaken, each swearing never to return, yet none spoke of it openly. Their silence was its own kind of proof. The rituals, whether imagined or real, seemed to grow bolder. People spoke of seeing smoke rise from the sisters' chimney at hours when no fire should have been lit, carrying with it a foul stench like burnt hair and iron. Some claimed they heard singing, strange, drawn-out tones that echoed unnaturally, neither melody nor language, but something in between. Others swore they saw figures, robed and hooded, slipping into the house under the cover of night, though no one could say where they came from or where they went after. The fear that gathered around the Holcomb sisters was unlike the ordinary dread of outlaws or violence. Gunmen could be fought, thieves could be punished, but what the sisters represented felt untouchable, something that reached beyond the mortal order of things. Their calm smiles, their measured words, their ability to silence suspicion with a single glance. It all deepened the sense that they commanded forces no lawman could contain. Still, there were those who could not resist their pull. Curiosity has always been stronger than fear, and the promise of answers about death, about fortune, about fate itself, drew some toward them like moths to flame. Those who entered their house for such answers often emerged changed, eyes shadowed, words clipped, as though some part of themselves had been left behind. The rituals, the séances, the whispers of forbidden knowledge, they became the town's unspoken obsession. Even those who claimed to disbelieve could not stop talking about them in hushed tones, unable to shake the image of those lace curtains glowing faintly in the dark, concealing acts that might never see the light of day. Each rumor layered upon the last until the sisters no longer seemed like women at all, but something other, something that belonged less to the town and more to whatever haunted its edges. The sisters' secret world began to surface not in a dramatic confession, but in whispers, subtle irregularities that the townsfolk of Colorado could not ignore. In a town where everyone's business was known, the lives of Clara and Evelyn seemed curiously opaque, as though wrapped in a veil that no one could pierce. For years the town accepted their story at face value, two women managing their parents' estate after their untimely deaths. Yet cracks began to appear in this narrative, and those cracks revealed something chilling: evidence of hidden rituals, unexplained deaths, and a network of influence that stretched far beyond what two women in a remote western town should have been capable of. People began to notice how often misfortune struck anyone who crossed them. A stable hand who quit after claiming to hear chanting in the barn was later found dead in the woods, frozen in a position of terror, his eyes wide open as if they had seen something unspeakable. The official word was that he had wandered into a snowstorm unprepared. But the locals whispered otherwise. The property itself was both alluring and unsettling. The house, built on the remnants of a Spanish mission, carried an atmosphere that made visitors uneasy. The wood groaned differently. In its halls, the floors seemed to sigh under your steps, and the air always felt heavy, as though holding secrets. Some said the sisters never let anyone into certain rooms. When workmen were hired to repair a collapsed roof beam, they were explicitly told to stay out of the cellar. But one worker, emboldened by curiosity, swore he peeked inside when the sisters weren't watching. What he saw unnerved him so deeply, he left town the same day. According to the brief words he muttered in the saloon before vanishing, the cellar contained markings on the walls, circles carved into the stone, and bundles of something wrapped in cloth, stacked like offerings. He refused to describe it further, as though speaking aloud would invite some curse. The sisters maintained an image of dignity in public. Clara often attended church, sitting near the front pew, her veil low, her hymns sung softly, but with a piercing, almost hypnotic tone. Evelyn rarely appeared at gatherings, but when she did, her presence unsettled everyone. She had a way of looking at people too long, as if she was calculating something behind her eyes. Some swore she knew their secrets without ever speaking a word. It was this duality, the soft-spoken, respectable facade against the backdrop of unexplainable tragedies, that made the rumors impossible to dismiss. Then came the livestock deaths. At first, it was blamed on coyotes, but ranchers soon noticed that the bodies of their cattle and horses were not torn apart like predator kills. Instead, they were found perfectly intact, drained of blood, their bodies left in strange arrangements. The pattern was always near the sisters' land, as though something connected to their property was responsible. A few ranchers accused them directly, but those who did met misfortune soon after. One man's barn burned down in the middle of the night, though no fire had been lit. Another's son went missing for 2 days, and was found near a creek, alive but unable to speak ever again. The town sheriff, a weary man named Harland McCready, tried to keep order by dismissing the gossip. He insisted that the cattle deaths were due to disease, that the boy's silence was trauma, and that barns sometimes burned from lantern accidents. But privately, Harland admitted to a confidant that the sisters unsettled him deeply. He recalled one evening when he rode out to their property to question them about trespassing complaints. Evelyn met him at the door. She smiled faintly, said nothing, and simply stared at him. Harland later confessed that he felt an overwhelming urge to leave immediately, as though his body rejected being near her. He rode back without asking a why. single question. He couldn't explain it, only that in her presence, his resolve evaporated. The sister's influence was not confined to eerie events. It began to seep into decisions made in the town itself. Disputes that reached the council, often resolved in ways that benefited them. Land auctions curiously ended with them as the highest bidders, even when others had offered more. It was whispered that Judge Marlowe, who presided over such affairs, visited their house late at night. What bargains were struck inside those walls, no one could say, but the outcomes were visible in daylight. Clara and Evelyn were weaving a quiet empire of control. The church grew uneasy. Reverend Pike, a stern but devout man, spoke in sermons about the dangers of false piety and the masks of evil that could hide among believers. Though he never named them directly, his warnings were clear. And yet, even Pike seemed reluctant to confront them openly. His daughter fell ill suddenly, wasting away in a manner the town doctor couldn't diagnose. Some believed it was a warning, a silent message from the sisters to keep his sermons vague. Pike's resolve wavered, his tone softened, and though he still spoke of darkness, he stopped urging action. One night in late autumn, a group of townsmen gathered in secret to discuss the growing unease. They were ranchers, shopkeepers, men who had lost livestock or children to unexplained terrors. They swore among themselves to investigate, to finally uncover what the sisters were hiding. They approached under cover of darkness, armed with lanterns and shotguns. But as they neared the house, a sudden fog rose from the ground, unnaturally thick, swallowing their light. The horses spooked, bolting in every direction, leaving the men stumbling in confusion. By the time they regrouped, they swore they heard whispers in the fog, voices calling them by name. Terrified, they abandoned their mission. None dared try again. The events surrounding Clara and Evelyn became less like ordinary life and more like a tale whispered around firesides, a story that blurred the line between superstition and fact. Their control was not loud or visible, but insidious, woven into fear, into coincidence, into the way people's resolve broke when they stood too close. And as much as the townsfolk wanted to dismiss it, the mounting evidence of unnatural happenings could not be ignored. They began to ask questions no one had dared before. What had the sisters really inherited from their parents? Was their family touched by something far older than Colorado itself? And most disturbingly, were they human in the way the rest of the town was, or had they crossed into some forbidden practice that kept them tethered to forces unseen? It was in these questions, these uneasy silences that followed them, that the truth began to crack open. Not in bold revelations, but in the dread that settled over the town whenever the sisters' names were spoken. The house that the sisters inhabited was not simply a structure of wood and stone. It was a vault for memories that refused to die. In the flickering lamplight, visitors recalled how shadows seemed to linger too long against its walls, how whispers traveled through rooms when no one else was present, and how an unnatural stillness pressed down upon anyone who dared step inside after sunset. Locals insisted that the building itself seemed alive, a container for unspeakable acts, and that the very timbers had absorbed the screams and sobs of its former occupants. This was not merely superstition. When new residents tried to settle in, they did not last long. They claimed they awoke at night to the sound of footsteps pacing directly outside their doors, or to the faint cries of a woman begging someone to stop. These accounts were dismissed by skeptics as tricks of the mind, Yet they followed the same pattern across decades, making it impossible to deny that something intangible but deeply malignant still resided there. The sisters' presence, though long gone, felt strangely undiminished. Their story was more than a tale whispered around campfires. It was etched into the soil itself. The mystery was not only what they had done, but why their shadows remained anchored to this particular place. Rumors circulated that the women practiced rituals in secret, calling on forces to cloak their crimes in silence. Others insisted the house had been cursed before they even arrived, and that they had merely been vessels chosen to carry out its darkness. Whatever the truth, those who stayed within its walls too long often left with vacant stares, as if they had glimpsed something behind the veil of ordinary life that had no name. Travelers who stopped in Colorado during those years often heard. Locals warned them away from the property, but the warnings carried no clear explanation. Some would only mutter, "The sisters will have their due," and then change the subject, eyes darting nervously as though afraid that even speaking about them could draw unwanted attention. The secrecy surrounding the house was as chilling as the stories themselves. Why did no one ever fully explain what had happened? Why were records incomplete? Names missing from registries, official reports conveniently misplaced. The silence hinted at collusion, as if authorities themselves had participated in a cover-up meant to preserve the town's fragile reputation. Those who pieced together fragments of the past noted strange patterns: farmhands vanishing after brief employment, lodgers who never returned from their rented rooms, and financial ledgers that showed unexplained gains by the sisters despite no legitimate source of income. The town's wealthiest men avoided speaking of their connection to the women, yet several of them were last seen near that house. Their disappearances never led to thorough investigations, which made residents whisper about bribery, coercion, and the possibility that the sisters possessed secrets powerful enough to blackmail even the most influential figures. Fear, it seemed, kept the truth locked away far more effectively than walls or padlocks ever could. Late in the autumn of 1881, a miner's wife testified in hushed tones that she had seen one of the sisters in the dead of night, dragging a heavy trunk across the yard toward a shallow ravine. The witness did not follow, but she claimed she heard the metallic scrape of a shovel against earth, followed by a hollow thud that echoed too sharply to be mistaken for stone. By dawn, the trunk was gone, and no questions were raised. Fear silenced her until years later, when guilt finally overcame her. But by then, whatever evidence might have been uncovered had long since rotted away beneath soil and pine roots. The sisters' reputation became paradoxical. On the surface, they were seen attending church, hosting tea for select neighbors, and donating modest sums to charitable efforts. Their smiles were polite, their manners impeccable, but behind closed doors, rumors of their cruelty spread like wildfire. Servants whispered about strange stains on the floors that never fully scrubbed clean, about parcels burned in the fireplace late at night, and about locked rooms no one was ever permitted to enter. Even more unsettling were the claims that faint chanting could sometimes be heard through the cracks of those locked doors, low voices reciting phrases in a language no one recognized. Whether it was prayer, incantation, or simply madness, no one could say. But the impression lingered. Whatever took place within those walls was not meant for human eyes or ears. The weight of their secrets pressed heavily upon the community. Whenever livestock were found mutilated or children reported nightmares of women standing silently at their bedside, the blame inevitably circled back to the sisters' house. Yet no one dared confront them openly. The townsfolk lived in a limbo of suspicion and silence, trapped between their fear of the women and their fear of acknowledging the darkness within their midst. It was safer to avert one's gaze, to pretend nothing was wrong, than to provoke forces they did not understand. That hesitation was precisely what allowed the sisters' reign of quiet terror to stretch on, year after year, until their deeds became less rumor and more legend. Even as time wore on and the sisters eventually vanished from public record, the aura of their house did not fade. Travelers who unknowingly passed by reported sudden feelings of dread, overwhelming nausea, or the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Animals refused to graze near the property. Horses balked and reared if led too close, and birds seemed to avoid nesting in the trees that surrounded the house. The earth itself seemed to reject the place, as though it carried scars too deep to heal. Today, historians still struggle to reconcile the fragments that remain. Court records that should exist do not. Property transfers are incomplete, entire. Pages missing from official ledgers. It is as though someone deliberately scrubbed the history clean, leaving behind only traces too faint to draw clear conclusions. And yet, the stories endure, carried forward by oral tradition, by the descendants of those who swore they felt the sisters gaze upon them long after they were gone. That persistence of memory suggests something deeper than folklore, something that clings to the soul of a place when ordinary explanations fall short. The unanswered questions linger in the silence. How many disappeared because of the sisters? What truths were hidden beneath their cultivated image of respectability? Why was the town complicit in burying their sins beneath layers of silence? The absence of clarity only deepens the mystery. In the end, the house stands not just as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that evil often thrives in plain sight, hidden beneath smiles and Sunday best, surviving in the spaces where fear keeps lips sealed and eyes averted. The sisters may be gone, but their secrets endure, echoing through the walls of that house, waiting for anyone bold or foolish enough to listen. When the final layers of secrecy began to unravel, the story of the sisters no longer felt like the shadowed whispers of neighbors or the mutterings of fearful men at the saloon. It became a matter of documented testimony, sheriff's reports, and the quiet but undeniable stain they left on Colorado's history. By the late months of 1881, the town could no longer pretend. Too many coincidences had aligned. Too many disappearances had clustered around one lonely homestead. And too many men spoke of a strange charm mixed with an unshakable dread when they recalled the sisters. What began as idle rumor evolved into something harder, something that demanded recognition. The darkness that once hovered invisibly above their home seemed now etched into the wooden walls themselves, visible to anyone willing to look. The first concrete shift came not from the sheriff, not from a preacher, and not even from the townsfolk, but from a stranger who happened to keep better notes than most. He was a traveling surveyor, a man paid to map the outer reaches of Colorado's growing settlements, and his journals, later uncovered, described in meticulous detail what he found peculiar about that isolated house. He noted the lack of livestock, despite smoke curling from the chimney daily, the peculiar absence of men who had once taken up boarding there, and the way the two women seemed to tend their grounds more at night than in the day. He wasn't a superstitious man, yet even he wrote in the margins of his survey maps, something unnatural about this place, avoid after dark. That single line, found years later, was the earliest surviving written observation of the unease that had otherwise existed only in memory. But the real turning point was a disappearance that could not be ignored. A local ranch hand, well-liked and dependable, went missing after being last seen heading toward the sisters' property. Unlike the drifters and strangers who vanished without family to demand answers, this man had friends who worked cattle, who carried rifles, who asked questions when one of their own failed to return. For the first time, the house became more than a curiosity. It became a suspect. The men who searched did not find the ranch hand, but they found torn fabric snagged on the barbed wire fence bordering the sisters' land. They found a boot print, leading in but not leading out. They found silence when they called his name. The sisters explained it away, as they always did, with calm voices and carefully chosen words. They said he had left, perhaps chasing work farther north. They said, the land swallowed men sometimes, that mines collapsed and storms struck, and bodies were never found. But this time the explanations rang hollow. The missing ranch hand was known for being steady, rooted, unlikely to vanish without word. The sheriff took a greater interest now, though even he seemed to wrestle with fear. When he questioned the sisters, townsfolk recalled, his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his hip. Still, the law could not convict on suspicion alone. No bodies had yet surfaced, no physical evidence beyond the whisper-thin fabric and a trail that ended where the soil seemed freshly disturbed. Yet neighbors began to avoid the road leading past their property. Wagons took longer routes. Men who once glanced admiringly at the women now crossed the street rather than risk a conversation. Isolation deepened around them, but rather than wither, the sisters seemed to thrive on it. There was talk that they had power in solitude, that their home became stronger the more people feared it. Then came the night a boy from the town swore he saw lanterns moving in the orchard behind the house, long after midnight. At first dismissed as a child's fancy, his claim grew weight when a second witness, a woman hauling water at dawn, said she too had seen movement. Two figures digging into the earth by lamplight, their skirts dragging through the soil. Days later, when a rancher crossed the property boundary chasing a stray cow, he described the smell of turned earth and something else he could not name but made his stomach turn. He never retrieved his cow. What followed was a slow but inevitable reckoning. People began to speak more freely about the men who had vanished. A traveling peddler, a prospector flush with new gold dust, a preacher rumored to have dined with the sisters, all gone. Patterns that had once seemed disconnected now aligned with chilling precision. The sisters had always denied involvement, always cloaked themselves in charm or silence, but the net of suspicion tightened. They were no longer the subject of gossip. They were the subject of fear. Sheriff's records, preserved in fragments, tell of his final attempt to confront them formally. He brought 2 deputies, both armed, and entered the home under the guise of routine questioning. What he wrote in untold, his report was sparse but chilling. House colder inside than out. Windows covered, light scarce, smell of earth and iron. He described speaking with the sisters, who were calm, almost amused, answering every question with patience, but never with clarity. He noted their insistence that they had done nothing wrong, that the men who vanished were wanderers who had moved on, that the town's suspicions were the product of fear, not fact. Yet the sheriff's notes ended abruptly with a line that historians have never forgotten. Their eyes, 2 against 3 of us, but I swear they held the ground. The deputies refused to return to that house again. One left town entirely within weeks, abandoning his post. The other took to drink, telling anyone who would listen that he had never feared death until he stood in that parlor. Though no arrests were made, the sisters had effectively been tried in the court of public opinion. And while no jury ever sentenced them, the people delivered their own verdict. The house was cursed, the women untouchable, their secrets locked away but undeniable. The months wore on, the land around them grew barren. Crops failed nearby, livestock sickened. Whether by coincidence or curse, the community linked every misfortune to the sisters. When fires swept through part of the valley, sparing their property alone, it was taken as proof that unnatural forces shielded them. The whispers hardened into certainty. The sisters had made a pact, and their survival came at the cost of others. Men stopped speaking their names aloud, as if to do so might invite their gaze. Children were warned never to stray near their property. And still, the disappearances ceased, not because the threat had ended, but because no one dared approach again. By the end of 1881, the sisters lived alone in their house, surrounded by silence and suspicion. They were not jailed, not punished by law, but they were marked forever. Their dark legacy endured not because of official verdicts or written records, but because of the chilling consistency of fear. Every man who vanished, every rumor that refused to fade, every journal entry and sheriff's note painted the same picture. 2 women isolated on the frontier, who carried secrets too heavy to remain buried. And though their true deeds were never fully proven, the weight of silence, the unease of witnesses, and the vanishing lives left behind ensured that their story would echo far beyond that lonely year in Colorado. What you've just heard is more than a story. It's a reminder that history doesn't always rest quietly in the past. Some pieces refuse to stay buried, rising up in whispers and fragments, daring us to look closer. And that's what this channel is all about, taking you into the hidden corners, the forgotten rooms, and the dark truths that were never meant to be uncovered. If you felt that unsettling pull tonight, the feeling that you've brushed against something both forbidden and fascinating, then this is only the beginning. Every week we bring forward new accounts that stretch from the shadows of abandoned towns to the locked halls of asylums, to the secret lives of people history nearly erased. These aren't tales you'll find in your school books. They're the kind of stories that make you question how much of what we know has been deliberately left out. So if you're ready to keep venturing deeper, I invite you to subscribe right now. Tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in this journey into the darker side of history. Together we'll peel back the layers piece by piece and step into places where most refuse to go. And before you leave, I want to hear from you. Which moment in tonight's story stayed with you the most? Was it the detail that disturbed you, or the silence that followed it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the conversation doesn't end here. It begins with you.